The night my husband thought he was being funny was the night I stopped being afraid of him. I was sitting at the dinner table when it happened, completely unprepared, completely trusting, completely wrong about who I was married to. My hands went numb first, then my legs stopped responding, and for 47 seconds I genuinely believed I was dying. He was laughing. His mother was covering her mouth, trying to hide her smile. And when I finally caught enough breath to say that something was seriously wrong, my own mother looked at me from across the room and said, "Lousia, you have always been so sensitive." That sentence lived in my chest for months. But the medical report, the one my doctor printed and signed and my lawyer eventually held in both hands, that sentence lived somewhere far more permanent. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something honestly. If the person you trusted most in the world did something that hurt you badly, and then called it a joke, and then the people who were supposed to protect you growing up agreed with them, what would you do? Would you stay quiet to keep the peace? Would you convince yourself it was not that serious? Or would you finally decide that your pain deserved to be taken seriously, even if you had to be the only one who took it seriously first? Stay with Lousia, because this is the story of what happens when a woman finally stops apologizing for being hurt. My name is Lousia, and for most of my marriage I told myself I had chosen well. Marcus was not a bad man on the surface. He was charming in the way that some people are charming, not because they are genuinely warm, but because they have spent years learning which version of themselves gets the best reaction from a room. He knew how to make people laugh. He knew how to make an entrance. He knew how to tell a story at a dinner party and have everyone leaning forward by the third sentence. What he did not know, or maybe what he knew and chose to ignore, was how to be a husband when no one else was watching. We had been married for 4 years when the prank happened. 4 years of a marriage that looked fine from the outside and felt like something was always slightly off from the inside. Marcus came from a family that used humor as a shield for everything. Bad news, make a joke, serious conversation, deflect with a one-liner, emotional pain, turn it into a story you could tell at the next gathering and get a laugh. His parents, Raymond and Connie, were the same way. Raymond was the kind of father-in-law who would slap you on the back too hard and call it affection. Connie was the kind of mother-in-law who smiled beautifully while saying things that left a bruise. My own parents, Earl and Meredith, were quieter people. My mother believed strongly in keeping peace above almost everything else. She had grown up in a family where emotions were a sign of weakness, and she had passed that belief to me without either of us realizing it for a very long time. My father was a kind man, but conflict made him physically uncomfortable. He would leave the room if voices got too loud. He had spent his whole life finding the nearest exit whenever tension arrived. I had grown up believing that the most important thing a woman could be was uncomplicated, easy to be around, not too much trouble. That belief was the very thing Marcus had counted on, even if he never said it out loud. The night of the prank was a Saturday in late October. We were hosting a dinner at our house for both sets of parents and 2 of Marcus's closest friends, a couple named Derek and Sasha. It was supposed to be a relaxed evening. I had spent most of the afternoon cooking, and the table looked genuinely beautiful by the time everyone arrived. Candles, cloth napkins, a centerpiece I had put together from things in our backyard. I remember feeling proud of it. I remember thinking this was one of those evenings that might become a good memory. We were on the main course when it happened. Marcus had, at some point during the day while I was occupied with cooking, switched out my glass of sparkling water with something he thought was harmless. He had mixed a combination of dissolved candy, food-grade carbonation powder, and this is the part his lawyer would later argue about at length, a small amount of an over-the-counter sleep aid dissolved in liquid. He had told Derek about it ahead of time. Derek had thought it was funny. Sasha had not. What Marcus expected was that I would get drowsy mid-dinner, maybe nod off, and everyone would laugh. What Marcus did not account for was that I had started taking a new prescription medication 3 weeks earlier for a blood pressure condition my doctor had caught at a routine checkup. That medication had a clearly documented interaction warning. The warning was on the prescription label. It was in the paperwork my doctor gave me. It existed in writing, which meant it existed in a way that would later matter enormously. The combination hit me within 20 minutes of eating. I remember putting down my fork because my right hand felt strange. Then I noticed my lips were tingling. Then there was a heaviness in my chest that spread downward through my body, and my legs stopped feeling like they belonged to me. I tried to say something and my words came out slow and slurred. The room felt like it was tilting. I looked at Marcus and I saw his face shift, not from concern, but from the early stages of realizing that something had gone differently than he planned. I remember saying, "Something is wrong, I cannot feel my legs." He said, "You're fine, babe, relax." I said it again, more clearly. "Marcus, I cannot feel my legs." And that was when his mother Connie laughed. A short sound quickly covered, but I heard it. Sasha heard it. The room heard it. My mother looked at me from across the table with the expression I had seen my whole life, the one that said, "Please do not make this uncomfortable." She said, "Lousia, honey, you've always been a little sensitive. Maybe you just need some air." I want you to understand something important about what happened in that moment. I was not being dramatic. I was not performing. I was a 31-year-old woman sitting at her own dinner table, in her own home, unable to feel the lower half of her body, while the people around her decided collectively that the more important thing was making sure the evening was not disrupted. My father stood up and said he would get me some water. Raymond made a joke I cannot repeat without my stomach turning. Marcus stood up slowly. The way someone stands up when they are realizing a situation is more serious than they planned, but still hoping it will correct itself. Sasha was the one who called the emergency services. She did it quietly, stepping into the kitchen with her phone. She told me later she made the decision the second she saw my face and knew the difference between someone being dramatic and someone being genuinely frightened. Sasha had worked 2 years as a medical receptionist before she met Derek. She recognized what real physical distress looked like. The ambulance arrived 11 minutes later. I was in the hospital for 2 nights. The doctors ran a full panel of tests. The interaction between whatever Marcus had dissolved in my drink and my blood pressure medication had caused a temporary but serious drop in blood pressure combined with a neurological response that explained the numbness. My doctor used words like potentially dangerous and fortunate timing, and you were lucky this resolved without permanent damage. She wrote all of it down. She documented the interaction. She documented the timeline I gave her about what I had eaten and drunk that evening, and she was very thorough about asking whether I had consumed anything unusual. I told her about the glass that tasted different. I told her about the fizzing sensation I noticed but dismissed because I assumed Marcus had just bought a different brand of water. She made a note, a long, specific, carefully worded note. Marcus came to the hospital both nights. He brought flowers the second night. He told me he was sorry. He told me he had no idea I was on that medication, which was partially true in the way that selective ignorance is partially true. I had mentioned the prescription at dinner 2 weeks earlier. His response at the time had been to change the subject because football was on. He had not asked what the medication was for. He had not asked if there were any dietary restrictions. He had not behaved like a husband who was paying attention, and I had not pushed it because I was too used to not pushing things. On the second night in the hospital, Derek came to visit. He was uncomfortable and sweating and not making eye contact properly. He said he had not known I was on medication. He said he thought it was just a funny bit. He said Marcus had told him the sleep powder was nothing serious. And then, because Derek was genuinely a decent person underneath the poor decision-making, he said, "I think you should know that Sasha is furious with both of us. She says we need to tell you everything." He told me everything. The preparation, the intention, the specific thing Marcus had purchased and dissolved. The fact that Marcus had tasted it himself first to make sure it would not be obvious. The fact that Marcus had done similar things before, smaller pranks, less serious, but the same pattern of thinking that his entertainment was more important than another person's experience of their own body. I listened to everything Derek said without interrupting. I am good at listening. I had spent 4 years in a marriage becoming very good at listening quietly to things that deserved a stronger response. But something was different this time. I felt it physically, like a temperature change. I was lying in a hospital bed, still slightly weak, and something in me had gone very, very still. Not the quiet of someone keeping the peace. The quiet of someone who had finally, fully, heard enough. I said, "Thank you for telling me, Derek," and I meant it. He left. I sat in the hospital room alone for a long time. I did not call Marcus. I did not call my mother. I stared at the ceiling and had the most honest conversation with myself I had probably ever had. I thought about the 4 years. I thought about the way Marcus laughed at things that were not funny to me. I thought about the way his family treated my discomfort like a personal inconvenience. I thought about my mother's face at the dinner table, the "please do not make this difficult" expression. And I thought about how many times I had modeled my own behavior on that expression. How many times I had swallowed something real to make an evening easier. I thought about the word dramatic. How many times it had been used on me. By Marcus when I cried. By Connie when I brought up something that bothered me. By my own mother when I was a child and I told her that something had hurt my feelings. The word dramatic was a door being shut in someone's face while smiling at them, and I had walked into that door so many times that I had stopped flinching. But I was flinching now. When I was discharged from the hospital, I did not go straight home. I went to my sister Paulette's apartment. Paulette was 2 years older than me, lived alone, and had always had the kind of clear-eyed view of my marriage that I had been too afraid to look at directly. She opened the door when she saw me, and she did not say anything. She just stepped aside and let me in and made tea and sat with me at her kitchen table while I talked for almost 2 hours without stopping. Paulette said 3 things that mattered. She said, "He put something in your drink without your knowledge or consent. That is not a prank. That has a legal name." She said, "The fact that everyone around you called you dramatic while you were physically unable to feel your legs is the reason you have spent 4 years doubting yourself." And she said, "You do not have to decide anything tonight, but you do have to stop pretending this is okay." I stayed at Paulette's for 3 days. On the 4th day, I made an appointment with a lawyer named Caroline Marsh. Paulette had found her name through a friend. I did not tell Marcus I was going. I told him I was visiting Paulette again to rest. He seemed relieved that I was not asking him to talk about what happened. He texted me that evening with a message that said, "I really am sorry, Lou. You know I didn't mean for it to go that way." I read that message 3 times. I noticed that it was an apology for the result, not for the decision. He was sorry it went wrong, not sorry he had done it. That difference was the kind of thing the old Lousia might have talked herself out of noticing. The new Lousia, the one sitting in her sister's apartment 3 days after being discharged from a hospital, wrote the difference down in a notebook and kept the notebook. Caroline Marsh had a small office with large windows, and she did not make me feel foolish for being there. I laid out everything. The dinner, the drink, the hospital stay, Derek's account, the medical documentation my doctor had already given me, the prescription label with the interaction warning printed on it in clear language. Caroline listened the way lawyers listen, very still, very focused, occasionally writing something down with a small nod. When I finished, she said, "Lousia, what your husband did falls under several possible legal categories depending on how you want to proceed. At minimum, this is knowing or unknowing administration of a substance to another person without their consent, with documented harmful effects. The medical evidence is already there. The witness account from Derek and from the paramedics who transported you is already there. What do you want to happen?" I told her I needed time to think about that part. She said, "Take the time, but do not destroy anything. Save every text message, every voicemail, every medical document, and every receipt. And do not tell your husband you came here." I nodded. I went back to our home 4 days after my discharge. Marcus had cleaned the kitchen and bought fresh flowers for the counter and cooked dinner. It was the domestic version of an apology, the kind that substitutes action for conversation, changes in behavior for actually talking about the behavior. I ate dinner across from him and watched him the way you watch someone when you are seeing them newly. Not with hatred, with clarity. The difference between those 2 things is enormous. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life. I was still living in our house. I was still sleeping in our bed. I was still making coffee in the morning and answering his texts during the day. But I was also building something on the side, quietly and methodically, in the same way that I had once learned to build a life that looked fine on the outside. Only this time, I was building in the right direction. I met with Caroline twice more during that period. She explained my options clearly. A civil case was possible given the documented harm. A formal complaint was possible. Divorce proceedings, if I chose to go that route, would be complicated by shared property. We owned our home together, and Marcus had his name on several accounts I had contributed heavily to over the years. Caroline was very clear with me about something that took me by surprise the first time she said it. She said, "Lousia, I want you to look at the financial history of this marriage before you make any decisions about how you want to proceed. Sometimes what looks like an emotional situation has a practical core that matters just as much." She was right about that. I had been working as a project manager for a mid-sized logistics company since before Marcus and I married. My salary was solid. My bonuses were consistent. In the 4 years of our marriage, I had been the primary financial contributor for at least 3 of them. Marcus worked in sales, and his income fluctuated wildly. There were periods where he brought in significant commission and periods where he brought in almost nothing. And during those nothing periods, it was my steady income that covered the mortgage, the groceries, the utilities, and the general cost of a life together. I knew this. But knowing something and looking at it clearly documented across 4 years of bank statements are 2 different kinds of knowing. Caroline had me pull the records. I spent one weekend at Paulette's apartment going through everything. Account by account, month by month, year by year. The picture that came together was stark. I had contributed approximately 73% of our household income over the course of the marriage. I had made every mortgage payment in the final 18 months because Marcus's sales territory had been restructured and his commissions had dropped significantly. Our savings account, which we nominally called joint, contained money that was overwhelmingly mine in its origin. I sat with those numbers for a long time. Then I thought about the dinner table, the candles I had bought, the food I had cooked, the glass Marcus had tampered with while I was in the kitchen being a good host, the flowers he bought when I came home from the hospital, bought with money that largely came from the account I had mostly filled. I called Caroline the next Monday morning. I said, "I know what I want to do." The process that followed was not simple or fast, but it was thorough. Caroline filed the initial paperwork for a separation and began formal documentation of the financial history. She also connected me with a colleague who handled the civil complaint separately, the matter of what Marcus had put in my drink, what it had done to my body, and what the medical evidence clearly supported. Marcus found out about the separation filing on a Thursday afternoon. I was not home when he got the paperwork. I was at Paulette's. He called my phone 11 times in 2 hours. The 11th call I picked up. He was not angry, which surprised me. He was frightened, which told me something important about where his fear lived. He was not afraid of having hurt me. He was afraid of consequences. He was afraid of what the paperwork meant for him practically. That fear told me more than 4 years of dinner conversations. He said, "Lousia, come on. We can talk about this. This is extreme. It was a mistake. It was one mistake." I said, "Marcus, I have a document from my doctor that uses the words potentially dangerous. I have a hospital bill. I have a statement from Derek about what you planned and prepared. I have 4 years of bank records. And I have a lawyer who I trust completely. I think the conversation we need to have should happen through our attorneys." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Your parents know about this." I said, "My parents will know what I choose to tell them. Goodbye, Marcus." I ended the call. I will not pretend that did not shake me. My hands were trembling when I put the phone down. Paulette handed me tea and sat next to me on the couch, and we stayed there in silence for a while. It was the kind of silence that felt like the air after a very long storm, uncomfortable and clean at the same time. What happened next I had expected in some form, but was not fully prepared for in the specific details. Marcus called my parents. He called them that same evening. He got to them before I did, which was a deliberate choice, and he told them his version, which was essentially that Lousia had gone off the deep end over what was supposed to be a harmless dinner prank and was now hiring lawyers and blowing up a perfectly good marriage. He told my mother specifically that I had always had a tendency to take things too seriously and that he was worried about my mental state. My mother called me 20 minutes later. She did not ask how I was. She did not ask about the hospital stay. She said, "Lousia, Marcus is devastated. He loves you. This seems like a very drastic response to something that was an accident. People make mistakes. I listened to her say all of it. Then I said, Mom, I was in the hospital for 2 nights. I could not feel my legs. The doctor documented that the substance in my drink interacted with my medication in a way that could have caused lasting damage. She said, but it didn't. I said, that is not the point. She said, Lousia, I'm just saying that a happy marriage takes patience and forgiveness. Marcus has good qualities. You knew who he was when you married him. I said, I did not know he would put something in my drink without telling me. She said, he didn't mean for it to go that far. And there it was again. The same logic as Marcus's apology text. Sorry for the result, not for the decision. I had grown up in a house where that logic was the foundation, and it had taken me 31 years and 2 nights in a hospital to see it clearly. I said, Mom, I love you, but I need you to understand that I am not asking for your permission. I am asking for your support, and if that is not something you can give me right now, I need you to give me space instead. She did not know what to say to that. I had never said anything like it to her before. I could hear it in the silence. The small shift of someone who has always had a certain amount of control over a situation discovering that the control has changed. My father called the next day. He was gentler. He said he did not fully understand what was happening, but that he trusted I had my reasons. He said he loved me. He said he would not interfere. I thanked him and meant it. Over the next several weeks, the information about what Marcus had done began to spread through the wider family circle. Not because I announced it, but because Derek and Sasha were honest people, and they had their own feelings about having been present that evening. Sasha in particular was not quiet about what she had witnessed. She had called the ambulance. She had sat with me at the hospital for an hour before the others arrived. She felt responsible in the way that decent people feel responsible for things they could not fully prevent, and she made it clear in social settings that what Marcus had done was not acceptable. Raymond and Connie were furious, not at Marcus, at me. Connie called my cell phone and left a voicemail that I saved entirely because Caroline had told me to save everything. In the voicemail, Connie said that I was destroying her son's life over a misunderstanding, that I had always been too sensitive for a family like theirs, and that she hoped I would come to my senses before I did permanent damage to a marriage that many women would be grateful for. I played that voicemail for Caroline at our next meeting. Caroline listened to the entire thing without expression. Then she said, I want to make sure we have this properly documented. She made a copy. She kept a copy. I kept a copy. There was a dinner at Raymond and Connie's house in November, about 6 weeks after the separation filing. I was not invited, obviously, but Paulette's friend knew someone who was there, and the story that came back to Paulette was that Marcus spent the evening telling everyone that I had manipulated Derek into giving a false account, that the hospital situation had been exaggerated, and that I was trying to get money through legal tricks. He was building his narrative the way people build narratives when the facts are against them, loudly, repeatedly, and to every sympathetic audience he could find. I heard all of that and I felt something I want to name accurately. It was not anger, though there was some anger in it. It was grief. Grief for the person I had trusted. Grief for the evenings I had cooked and arranged and tried to make beautiful. Grief for the woman I had been 4 years ago who had looked at Marcus across a different dinner table at the beginning of everything and believed, genuinely believed, that she had found someone who would treat her like she mattered. That grief was real and I let it be real. Paulette sat with me through more than one evening where I cried in a way that was not dramatic. It was just honest. And there is a profound difference. The civil proceeding moved through its stages over the following months. Marcus's attorney argued that the substance was not intended to cause harm, that Marcus had no knowledge of the prescription interaction, and that the effect, while unfortunate, had been temporary and fully resolved. Caroline's response was precise and documented. She submitted the prescription label with the printed interaction warning. She submitted my doctor's notes from the 2 nights of hospital care. She submitted Derek's written account, which Rec provided willingly because, to his credit, he felt genuinely responsible and wanted to do the right thing when given the structured opportunity to do so. She submitted the hospital records. She submitted the paramedic report. She submitted Connie's voicemail as evidence of the family's response pattern. The mediation process was uncomfortable and long and required me to sit in a room with Marcus and both sets of attorneys and not look away from any of it. Marcus looked different in that setting. Smaller, somehow. Less like the man who could command a room at a dinner party. He was someone who had made a decision that he thought would get a laugh, and instead had found himself sitting across from documentation he could not argue with. The settlement was reached without going to full trial. I am not at liberty to disclose the specific terms, but I will say that what Caroline had called the practical core of the situation was addressed. The financial reality of our 4 years together was formally recognized. The house was resolved in a way that acknowledged who had actually been keeping it. I walked away from that marriage with my financial dignity intact, which mattered to me in a way I had not expected. It was not about money as a concept. It was about not having the practical reality of 4 years erased by a story Marcus was telling about who I was. The divorce itself was finalized 7 months after I left the dinner table that October evening with numb legs and a room full of people who called me dramatic. I want to talk about what happened with my mother because it matters to the full story and because it would be dishonest to leave it out. My mother came around, not immediately, not easily. It took 3 months and one very long phone call that I did not expect to go the way it did. She called me on a Sunday afternoon and she was crying, which I had almost never heard from her in my life. She said she had been thinking about what I had said to her, that I was not asking for her permission, I was asking for her support, and she said she had never had anyone say that to her before. Not her own mother, not my father. Not anyone. She said, "I think I taught you to be too quiet, Lousia, and I'm sorry." I cannot fully describe what those words did to me. My mother was a woman who had spent her entire life making the room comfortable for everyone else at the cost of herself, and she had handed that to me as love because it was the only love she knew how to give. Hearing her say she was sorry, not for a result, but for a pattern, for a belief she had built and passed on, was the kind of moment that reorders something in you permanently. I said, "I don't blame you, Mom, but I'm glad you said that." We talked for almost 2 hours that Sunday. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. My mother told me things about her own marriage, her own past, her own moments of swallowing pain to keep peace that she had never said to anyone. We were not the same after that call. We were better. It was the beginning of a relationship that actually told the truth, which was something I had not known we could have. My father, for his part, quietly made a point of calling me every Sunday after that. Not to discuss the situation, but just to talk, to ask how my week was, to tell me about the garden he was working on, the book he was reading, the small details of his days. It was his way of showing up, and I received it as what it was. The professional part of my life during those months was another story worth telling. When you are going through something that large privately, the world of work continues at the same pace, and I had always been good at keeping those two compartments separate. My performance at work did not suffer. If anything, the clarity I was developing in my personal life sharpened my focus professionally. I was given a promotion in January, 2 months after the separation filing. Senior project manager, with a team of 8 and a salary increase that made my financial position even more solid. I remember telling Paulette about the promotion over the phone, and she said, "Of course you got promoted. You have been the most organized person I know for 30 years. And then she said something that made me laugh for the first time in what felt like a long while. She said, "Also, stress either breaks people or it polishes them, and you, Lousia, have always been very stubborn." Marcus tried to contact me several times during the months that the legal process was moving. Most of it went through attorneys, but there were 2 personal attempts that I think are worth noting. The first was a handwritten letter that arrived at Paulette's address. He must have gotten it from someone, because I had not given it to him, in which he said he still loved me, that he had made a catastrophic mistake in judgment, that he had started seeing a therapist, and that he hoped one day I would be able to forgive him, in the way that would allow us to speak again. I read the letter. I kept it. I did not respond to it, not because I could not write something kind back, but because I had learned to be careful about the difference between a person who had genuinely changed and a person who was afraid of losing and calling that emotion love. Maybe Marcus had changed. Maybe the therapy was real. Maybe the regret was honest. But I had already built a life that did not require me to investigate that question, and I found I was at peace with not knowing. The second personal attempt was a voicemail, left at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday, in which his voice was thick and he said he had been having a hard time sleeping. He said he kept thinking about that evening, about the ambulance, about my face when I said I couldn't feel my legs. He said he had never meant for any of it and that he was ashamed. And then he said, quietly, "I should have listened to you more. I just didn't know how." That voicemail I listened to 3 times. Not because I was wavering, but because it was the most honest thing Marcus had ever said to me in 4 years of marriage. And there was something painful and important in the fact that he could only find that honesty once everything was already over. I did not call him back, but I kept the voicemail. I kept it not as evidence, but as a record of a moment when a person was telling the truth. Even the painful truths deserve to be kept somewhere. In the spring, nearly 8 months after the night of the dinner, I did something that I had been thinking about for a long time. I had a small gathering at the apartment I had moved into after the separation, just Paulette, 2 of my oldest friends from before the marriage, and Sasha, who I had grown genuinely close to through everything that had happened. We cooked dinner together. We set the table with cloth napkins and candles. We ate slowly and talked about real things. About work and about fears, and about the strange ways life reorganizes itself around you while you are just trying to get through the week. At one point, Sasha looked around the table and said, "This is really nice, Lousia. This feels like you." I thought about that for a long time afterward. This feels like you, not like a performance, not like a production for an audience, not like a table being set to impress someone who is going to rearrange it anyway, just a room where I felt like myself. There are things I know now that I did not know before the night of the prank. Not lessons that make me glad it happened, because you cannot be glad about a hospital stay and a marriage ending and a mother calling you dramatic while you could not feel your legs, but knowledge that I carry as something real. I know that the word dramatic is often used by people who benefit from your silence. I know that an apology for the result is not the same thing as an apology for the choice. I know that a relationship where you are primarily valued for being easy to be around is not the same thing as love. I know that financial clarity is not cold or mercenary. It is self-respect in a form that lasts. I know that the people who are supposed to protect you are sometimes the people who need to be taught that you are worth protecting. And I know that the moment you stop asking for permission to be hurt, something shifts in the room around you that cannot be undone. I know that Sasha's one quiet phone call to emergency services that October evening was worth more than 4 years of people telling me I was sensitive. Caroline Marsh sent me a note after the case was fully resolved. It was short. It said, "You handled this with a great deal of dignity, Lousia. Most people in your position don't stay this calm. It made our job much easier." I framed that note, not because I need validation, but because it was from someone who had seen the whole picture and still thought I had done well. Sometimes that matters. The matter of Marcus's family was its own long resolution. Raymond never contacted me. Connie sent one more message, months later, that was significantly more subdued than the voicemail. It said she hoped I was well and that she did not want any ongoing conflict. I wrote back a single sentence. I said, "I wish your family well." And I meant it in the neutral way that those words can mean when you have removed the heat from a situation and just want it behind you. Some things in life do not need dramatic final scenes. Some things just need to be finished. Professionally, the year following the divorce was the best stretch of my career. I was leading projects with real stakes and real results. I built a team that worked well and trusted each other. I was invited to speak at a company event about project management under pressure, which felt almost absurd given what I had privately lived through while professionally managing things so smoothly. But I gave the talk, and it was well received. Several colleagues came up aft, and said things that surprised me with their sincerity. One woman, a director from a different department, came up and said, "You spoke about knowing the difference between urgency and noise. I have been thinking about that all morning." I told her I had learned that distinction the hard way. She smiled like she understood what that meant without needing the details. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment that spring. The second bedroom I converted into an office because I work from home 2 days a week, and because I had spent years living in space that was arranged for other people, and I wanted a room that was purely mine. I painted it a very specific shade of blue. I filled it with plants. I put my medical documents and legal files in a single organized drawer, filed and labeled, not because I look at them often, but because having them organized made me feel that what had happened was real and documented and finished. My mother came to see the apartment in April. She stood in the doorway of my office and looked at the plants and the color of the walls and said, "This looks like you." It was almost exactly what Sasha had said at the dinner table, and I thought about how 2 people who had gotten very different things wrong had gotten this one thing right, and how that was its own kind of thing to carry. I am 32 years old now. I have a career I am proud of. I have a lawyer I would trust with anything. I have a sister who answered the door without needing me to explain first. I have 2 old friends who showed up to a dinner table with cloth napkins and candles and talked about real things. I have a mother who learned, later than either of us would have chosen, how to tell the truth. I have a father who calls on Sundays. I have a room painted blue. I have an organized drawer. And I have learned, with a completeness I did not expect, that the most important person who needed to stop calling me dramatic was me. For a long time, I had absorbed the language of the people around me. I had called my own pain sensitivity. I had called my own needs inconvenience. I had called my own instincts dramatic. I had learned to apologize for noticing things that deserved to be noticed, to soften reactions that were honest, to make myself easier to dismiss. And what that cost me was not just one bad marriage or one terrible dinner table or 2 nights in a hospital. What it cost me was years of not being fully present in my own life, years of managing how I appeared instead of deciding what I deserved. The prank, the hospital, the lawyers, the documents, the settlement, the apartment, the blue room, all of it was part of one long process of becoming someone who does not wait for other people to decide whether her pain is real. Her pain is real. She gets to decide that. My name is Lousia, and I am done apologizing for knowing what happened to me. Before you go, I want to leave you with one honest question that Lousia's story raises for all of us. How many times have you called your own pain dramatic before anyone else had the chance to? How many times have you made yourself smaller, easier, quieter, because the people around you seemed more comfortable with a version of you that did not take up space? If Lousia's story touched something real in you today, leave a comment and tell me the moment you stopped apologizing for being hurt. You do not have to share the whole story, just the moment, because those moments deserve to be witnessed and you deserve to know that someone is listening.